and get started. So with the interest of time, we do have, I see our promotoras verdes that are here, and so we'll go ahead and move forward with the presentation this evening. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. We are the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, and we have our Water Justice Leadership Training, the second in our series. And this evening, we're going to have a great presentation from Dr. Federico Castillo and Dr. Michael Mendez on climate change from the streets and the hidden costs of extreme heat. We will also have a co-host today, Leticia Corona, who is the co-founder and the co-chair of the UC Berkeley Chicano Latino Alumni Association, San Joaquin Valley chapter. And she will also be assisting us this evening in the training. So to move further along with our presentation, first and foremost, the purpose of the training is to inform our area of the various components that has to do with climate change, with water, and the training is being provided by the Proposition 1 Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program for the San Joaquin River funding area, the American River Basin Disadvantaged Communities. And so it is the training for our American River Basin community and our extended community and many of our folks who are in various other cities who are going to be able now, because of this digital component, be able to participate in our training. So again, thank you. And let me introduce to you our co-host, Leticia Corona. Leti.
Thank you, SB. It's such a pleasure to join you all. As SB had mentioned, I'm the co-chair and co-founder of the San Joaquin Valley chapter. We're based here well, I'm based in Fresno, but our chapter oversees all Bakersfield, Kern County, all the way to Stockton in the northern San Joaquin Valley. And it is a great honor for us to be able to partner with EJCW and Esperanza, who also is another co-chair. So thank you. And so we're looking forward to this great presentation, and we'll be giving more information about our chapter and ways that if there's any alumni here from the San Joaquin Valley that would like to get involved, again, we'll be sharing that information towards the end, and please stay tuned. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Leti. So with no further ado, we will go on to Dr. Michael Mendez. We have a full bio that will be available on the chat. We have it on Facebook. We also sent it out via our constant contact. Nonetheless, I do want to introduce and thank Dr. Michael Mendez. He is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine. And Michael holds 3 degrees in environmental planning and policy, including a PhD from UC Berkeley, go Bears, Department of City and Regional Planning, and a graduate degree from MIT. His research on the intersection of climate change and communities of color has been featured in national publications, including Urban Land, published by the Urban Land Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Fund Annual Report, the American Planning Association's Planning Magazine, Green 2.0, Leadership at Work, USA Today, and Fox Latino News. His new book, Climate Change from the Streets, published through Yale University Press 2020, is an urgent and timely story of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. And so let's welcome Mr. and Dr. Michael Mendez.
Great, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here today. A proud bear. I did my PhD in Department of Urban and Regional Planning, so it's a wonderful opportunity to be here. And I've worked before with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, so it's an organization and a topic that's dear to my heart. So let me share my screen. Today, I'm going to be talking about the ideas and concepts of environmental justice as it relates to the climate change policy and social movement. And I'm going to start with this graphic here. This is a campaign flyer from 10 years ago from the city of Oakland. And as you see here, it reads, "It's not just about polar bears," and really referencing about this old dichotomy or conceptualization that is of climate change, about being about the environment out there in the wilderness, out there in the Arctic, about melting glaciers and polar bears. And so that was a very tired idea of what climate change meant to the general public. And this was about 10 years ago. And in the 10 years since, environmental justice groups in particular have been fighting through conflicts and through other types of oppositional tactics and then collaboration to reconceptualize what climate change means from an equity and racial justice perspective. So as we can see from this campaign flyer about dealing with climate action planning in the city of Oakland, is focusing on the youth, focusing on communities. And one of the quotes from one of the individuals I interviewed in my book reads, "Up until the last decade, climate change tended to be a white affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. It hasn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in the urban centers. Most of the messages about climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gas emissions and not about people or public health or jobs, about really making climate change real. You have to make climate change real, focusing on outcomes that are important to people, such as people in their lives, such as public health, the health of their children, the asthma that their children are being confronted with and experiencing, and jobs, so the loss of jobs in communities, and how can a more sustainable economy, climate action contribute to some of the key necessities facing low-income communities of color. So before I jump into about my book, for many of you, you may have heard about earlier about what the environmental justice movement means, but I want to give you a quick history. So the environmental justice movement has been around for decades, 50, 60, 70 years. But in California, you may have heard about the United Farm Workers protest against landowners and farmers during the Great Boycott. A lot of that was focused on union issues, of course, and worker health and safety, but a lot of it was focused on pesticides as well, and the impact that these toxic chemicals were doing to the human health of workers as well as to the environment. So that's an environmental justice movement that typically is not associated with environmental justice. But the idea and concept of environmental justice came to the mainstream America in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina. This was a predominantly African-American county. And there was a situation where they wanted to site another landfill in this area that was experiencing a lot of environmental exposure from various hazardous industries. And this time, this new landfill that they wanted to site in the local community was a hazardous waste dump. So a lot of chemicals coming from the surrounding industries to be dumped in this landfill. So a lot of civil rights organizations came to help this community to protest, and the environmental justice movement is really derived and born from the civil rights movement from the 1960s. So some of the great leaders of the environmental justice movement came to Warren County, and they did die-ins. They laid in front of some of the bulldozers that were going to create some of this new landfill. And this garnered a lot of attention in the mainstream media. And ultimately, unfortunately, this protest and social movement was not successful. They did cite the landfill, but it really brought into the consciousness of American society about environmental justice and specifically environmental racism. How these individuals, Black, Latino, Native American individuals, are intentionally targeted for these type of noxious types of uses, and systematically they're also kept from the procedural and regulatory processes to participate in some of these environmental decisions. So this eventually led a few years later to the first ever release of the Toxic Waste and Race Report. This was done by faith-based organizations as well as civil rights organizations that was the first to quantitatively assess these toxic waste sites and how disproportionately they're being cited in African-American communities. And this led to a strong social movement and academic research that supported that environmental racism existed in low-income communities of color, particularly in this case, African-American communities. Eventually, this also led to definitions of what environmental justice should mean. As we see from the left-hand side, this is a US EPA definition of environmental justice, which is a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So the very straightforward type of definition. On the other side is an academic definition developed by an environmental justice scholar who works actively with communities of color. And his is a little bit more holistic, and it refers to those cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that the environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. So both are very important to our conceptualization and understanding and enforcement of environmental justice policies. But one, Professor Bryans acknowledges that how values and cultural norms are embedded within our policymaking process and our politics around climate change. Other scholars and community activists argue that there's 4 types of environmental justice. The first is procedural justice. Well, what I mentioned earlier, that people that are living next to these noxious facilities and pollution should be able to participate actively in that policymaking and political process and have an active and meaningful voice at the table. The second is distributive justice, identifying that not only that the environmental bads, the noxious uses, as well as the environmental goods, such as parks and conservation easements, that they should be evenly distributed throughout society, and that low-income communities of color should not be sacrifice zones for our industry and other types of pollution. The third type of justice centers around capabilities justice, which really acknowledges that for you to be able to be an active member in society, and particularly in the procedural process, and ensure that there's a distributive justice, there has to be capabilities. You have to have this idea of a holistic understanding of what safe and safety and community well-being means, meaning that individuals not only need to have a safe environment, but they also have to have access to quality education, quality housing, access to affordable health care, as well as other types of ideas and assets that make individuals capable and full members of society. And then the final idea is recognition justice, that before you enter into any type of policies and programs to address environmental racism and promote environmental justice, you have to start out with the fact, understanding that this environmental racism is historic and systemic, and is embedded within all aspects of our society, and that you must start there and understand that in some communities are not at the same starting point, so they should provide additional resources so that you can redress some of the inequalities and environmental racism or systemic racism that was occurring for decades, if not centuries. And so next, this takes me to this idea of challenging mainstream concepts of ideas. The environmental justice organizations were really active in talking about moving away from that idea of the polar bear, of the idea of wilderness, protecting only wilderness that's out there in the forest, in glaciers, and not the environment in your own backyard and in front of your streets or at your parks. And they also challenged mainstream groups such as Sierra Club, the World, the WWF, the Nature Conservancy, NRDC, for not having people of color on their staff or investing significant resources or relationship building in low-income communities of color. So this was in 1990 was a letter that they addressed to some of the Big Ten, what they call the Big Ten, the largest mainstream environmental groups, and I listed 4 of them there, and really calling them out in the media and embarrassing them and or shaming them because they didn't have more inclusive policies as well as an inclusive and diverse staff that represented the United States. So this finally leads me to this idea again of nature and what is not nature. In previous years before the environmental justice movement had a very strong say in various state, local, and federal policy arenas, the concept of the environmental or the environment was fairly just restricted to natural resource conservation, pollution, species extinction, or overpopulation. And it did not intersect with ideas of the social, such as what I talked about, capabilities justice, linking the environmental movement to access to jobs, housing, transportation, of course, public health, racial and sexual inequality, violence, poverty, reproductive freedom. So environmental justice groups really look towards thinking beyond a very narrow definition of the environment and even narrow definition of just environmental racism to really expand to gender inequality and sexual inequality as well. And also linking it up to reproductive freedom and reproductive justice and how the way in which we we conduct our environment and we protect our environment can have complications to women's reproductive health. So now I want to talk about my own research, taking this long history of the environmental justice movement, really trying to foreground people of color in the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement. I authored Climate Change from the Streets, How Conflict and Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement. This was published earlier this year by Yale University Press. And this really grew to the fact, just looking at our historic moment right now in California, over the last several months, we have been experiencing a major climate change crisis and historic racial unrest. In the last 4 months alone, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters such as fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, and hazardous air quality. And of course, a deep economic recession and the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events. For example, 5 of the 10 largest wildfires by acreage in California's history burned this year alone. These compounding disasters have exasperating health, social, economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequalities, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. To address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed the Green New Deal at the federal level, a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. For the last 2 decades, low-income people of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and have been often met with significant resistance. However, I'm here to say that there's really nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions are claimed to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing interests, racial, and power struggles that this implies. If we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate policy, the assumptions and social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change would do to human societies and our planet. For insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate solutions, one should look to the nearly two-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policies. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat from climate change is the disproportionate harm it causes to their bodies and the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about greenhouse gas models. Rather, it is also about opposing worldviews through which policy and science is seen. Yet California is still often seen as a homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. For example, in this book cover that's redacted, it's considered one of the definitive environmental histories of California. And it goes from the turn of from the 1800s to present day. And in this 200 or nearly 300-page book, people of color are only mentioned 3 entire times, and it's often in passing. So there's this erasure of people in color of enacting a comprehensive environmental policy and leadership. Therefore, I published my book, Climate Change from the Streets, with an explicit focus on people of color. My book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. This research is situated in my public policy work for the California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interactions of governments, businesses, and community-based organizations shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in Latino immigrant communities of Los Angeles that face multiple environmental threats. As a youth in Pacoima and San Fernando, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism. Whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties, they sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. This has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars alike. The case of California is particularly productive as a climate experiment. As the world's 5th largest economy and the only US state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap and trade program, a central market-based mechanism for ensuring carbon emissions reductions, is the 3rd largest in the world after the European Union and China. This program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate policy makes it an ideal place to investigate the dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. My multi-scale ethnographic policy approach weaves together an analysis of 3 interconnected case studies. The first looks at climate change and public health activism in 2 heavily impacted communities of color, Richmond and Oakland, California. The second looks at conflict over state-level carbon trading and use of revenues for investment in local communities most harmed by air pollution. And third, international and local implications of forest conservation projects in the global south, in this case, Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil, allowed under California's market-based climate change laws. These cases combine to review the contested politics of local, state, and transnational levels on which California makes climate change policy and takes action. For example, in Richmond, California, it has the Chevron refinery. It's the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in the entire state of California. And it also happens to be the one of the largest oil refineries west of the Mississippi. Not only is it the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions within the state, it's also one of the largest emitter of local pollutions, NOx and SOx and particulate matter that affects people's local, that affects human health in the state. And activists in Richmond, California, not only protest the inequitable environmental threats that the Chevron refinery poses at the city level, they also actively move between policy scales. And in my research, I show how environmental justice activists move from Richmond, California, but also work at the state capitol in Sacramento because they understand that California sees itself as a nation state. It has the 3rd largest cap and trade program in the world after the European Union and China, and understand that that global focus on its cap and trade system and its corresponding climate change programs are often focused on the global level and not so much at the local community. So they work, while they work in Richmond, California, they also work in Sacramento to try to rescale that global focus to make sure that the climate reduction strategies and benefits from these reduction strategies are targeted to places like Richmond and Oakland. But at the same time, these individuals are also simultaneously moving from Richmond, Sacramento, and also to United Nations and other global spaces, because California, again, sees itself as a global player, and it wants to link that cap and trade system, its climate change programs, to forest offset projects in Mexico and Brazil. And this has created some unique conflict where you have indigenous rights groups, human rights groups, protesting a California policy that wants to link to Mexico and Brazil, because this might cause a dispossession of land to create these forest conservation projects, meaning that indigenous individuals in the area might be displaced from their lands to create these conservation projects. So at the same time, you have indigenous rights activists protesting in Mexico, Brazil. You have California environmental justice groups also protesting the expansion to Mexico and Brazil because they want Chevron to be able to reduce carbon emissions in Richmond and not pay for carbon reductions in forests in another faraway place. So you have a unique coalition, a translocal coalition of California environmental justice activists teaming up with indigenous rights individuals from Mexico and Brazil and other parts of the global south to protest an expansion of California's climate change program. So to conclude, I have 3 aims of this multi-scalar type of research that I do in my book, Climate Change from the Streets. The first is to demonstrate that public health and environmental justice perspectives can be central to successful climate change policy development and implementation. So as I showed that redacted book cover, my book is intended to ensure that that erasure of people of color leading on climate change is not erased or whitewashed or greenwashed, and that to be able to show that environmental justice perspectives are valid and are important to climate change policy development and implementation. The second, I want to offer an interdisciplinary framework for theorizing the kinds of negotiations between scales and worldviews that are involved in the development of equitable climate change policy. So again, that multi-scale, how activists move from one from the local, state, regional to the global scale, and how they're all interconnected from a justice perspective, not an economic or only a policy perspective, but from the justice perspective, and to acknowledge that our worldviews on climate change and its corresponding policies are embedded with values and our position in society. And oftentimes that is a white, male worldview, and not a worldview that comes from the streets. And then finally, the last aim of my book is to provide a set of findings that activists can use to negotiate with governments and that legitimizes their perspectives about the differential impact of climate change on disadvantaged communities. I published my work with Yale University Press to highlight California's environmental justice movement for lessons learned for the rest of the country and for other governments throughout the world. So I want to thank you for this opportunity and look forward to talking to you about opportunities to advance climate justice, the climate justice and the environmental justice movement. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Mendez. That was absolutely amazing. And I feel empowered, energized, and validated by that plática that you just gave, that especially with our communities that we're working with here. And so, like I said, a lot of our Promotoras Verdes are on the call this evening. So I'm sure they'll have plenty of questions once you give them their assignment for their breakout room. So again, thank you. That was beyond informative, and I seriously feel validated by the work that that we're doing with the with your book. And we will be providing your book as part of the training to our promotoras. So just wanted to let you know that as well. And so if you can then guide us into what, in terms of the breakout session, the topic that you would like for the folks to discuss in their breakout session.
Sure, great. So we come off a very historic election, 4 years of a climate denier, 4 years of an anti-immigrant politician and politico, 4 years of some misogynist type of individual, and now we have a person that cares about the environment and equity issues. So my question for you in the breakout session is, as we move forward in this post-election sort of discussion and dialogue, what should we be asking out of the Biden-Harris administration so that we can address adequately environmental justice? How can we realize an environmental justice in the new Biden-Harris administration? So what would your priorities be for this new administration?
Okay, so then what we're going to do then is, based on the question that Professor Mendez has provided for us, then when you go into the breakout sessions, you'll automatically be put into various groups, and Rochelle will be doing that for us. And then when we come back, we will either you can self-select to answer the question via the chat, and then Professor Mendez will call upon you, or if not, then he will just go ahead and just call upon folks to share. So it's about just training, learning, and sharing here, and so then that's what we're going to do next. And then Rochelle, if you can then put us into our breakout sessions.
Sure, and if I could add, so again, yeah, your priorities, and I want to hear the priorities from you, the promotoras and the other individuals working on the ground. You're working on the ground, so I think that perspective is very important to understand what the Biden-Harris administration should be looking at. So you don't have to know about public policy, you don't have to know about politics, really, but really understanding what you see in your local communities and what should be done at the federal level, as well as the state, if you want to talk about the state and local level as well.
Okay, so then if we can go ahead now and move into the discussion, and Professor Mendez, if you want to, I don't know, let me see if we have anything in terms of chat. And if not, then if you want to go ahead and since you're also a co-host, and then call upon folks in terms of reporting back.
Sure, thank you for that opportunity. Does anyone want to volunteer first? Send me calling on them. Okay, let me just start. How about Rosa Moreno?
What was the question again, sir?
Oh, thank you for joining us, first of all. I appreciate you participating. If you could report back on what your group talked about in terms of what you see the priorities for the Biden-Harris administration.
Yeah, we discussed about having a lot to ask and like trying to find out what priorities would be good to start with, and also try to find ways to like find the correct words, I would say, for them to pay attention to our needs, our environmental needs. I spoke a little bit about my hometown, how there's a big dump really close to our residential area, and also about how in my partner's area there's a lot of people with asthma, which I can relate to that. I was sharing that I have I had 6 children, but I raised 10, and out of those 10, 6 of them have asthma. So we do have a big need of finding a way to get change.
Air quality. Where do you live?
I live in Avenel, California.
Where?
Avenel.
Avenel. Where's that near?
Avenel, California is the Central Valley,
Okay.
Kings County.
Okay, yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Yes.
Anthony, would you like to share your group's discussion?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we had discussed really, how important we are out here in California, just because of the diversity of our geography, and we have, we're facing several issues, from air pollution, water pollution, and that we could best get started by, forming a coalition. You'd have, different representation, across the board, whether it be, community leaders, environmental group leaders, as well as policymakers, and starting from the local, the state, gradually into the federal level. And one of the things that I know SB had pointed out, which I wish I could have thought of in our class earlier, was the importance of having appointed officials rather than elected officials, just because of a lot of the times they're self-interested, and it takes a lot of money. They don't really truly represent the community. They don't have their needs in mind. So that'd really be a good place to start.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of these regulatory bodies are appointed officials. They're still appointed by politicians. So somebody has to appoint them. But the idea is not to always just think about having a legislator or the city council member, which is really great for getting some policy change, but also behind the scenes is sometimes these little water boards, as you may know in your class, as well as the air boards and other types of smaller boards that do a lot of policy and what they call rulemaking, regulatory regulations that affect our health and our communities. So we have to not push just for equality in terms of our legislative bodies, but also these regulatory bodies as well. So SB, thank you, Anthony. SB, do we have time for one more question, or?
Yeah, you have time for one more.
Okay. How about Elizabeth Vasquez?
Well, in our conversation, we were talking about regulating clean water for many communities, like because they're still serving, like providing bad water, and also the help with the Environmental Policy Act, like with climate change, because they're not really regulating stuff with that, and it's really hurting small communities.
Okay. So what type of regulations?
Like many factories have like smokes, and they overwork many of the factories like that pollute the air, and it's bad for many people. Like she said that a lot of people here have asthma.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So it'd be
Great.
better if we did, yeah.
So better, a stricter regulation and making sure that they do regulation. Sometimes there are strict regulations, but they're not enforced. There's penalties, and sometimes these monetary penalties are so low that a factory doesn't care if you find them $500 per penalty, or even like $2,000 per penalty for some of these mega corporations. That's nothing. That's pocket change. It's cheaper for them to keep on paying the penalty, the multa, than them ever changing their technology, because changing the technology is a lot more expensive for them oftentimes. So yeah, greater regulations for protection of public health and safety, as well as enforcement of those laws once they're passed. So to wrap up, thank you everyone for this opportunity. I just wanted to highlight this new article that just came out a month or two ago called "The Invisible Victims of Disaster: Understanding the Vulnerability of Undocumented Latino and Indigenous Immigrants." So I co-wrote this with Genevieve Flores Haro, who's a community organizer with the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project in Oxnard, California, and Lucas Zucker, who's with CAUSE, the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. They're an environmental and social justice organization. And both Genevieve and Lucas were at the forefront, or at the front lines, of the Thomas Fire, which happened in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties in 2017 to 2018. Until recently, this was the second largest wildfire in California's history by acreage, and there was a lot of damage, and most of the media reports were about hillside and coastal mansions, the destruction of wealthy landowners, but little did it talk about undocumented migrants, particularly farm workers, that were impacted from the wildfire, either from working out in the fields to protect the crops from smoke and ash, or the other disaster impacts from unemployment and other health risks. So this is this is the first academic research project ever to look at wildfires from an undocumented migrant perspective. And not only is it the first, it's also the first that's also co-written by community advocates. So I encourage you to take a look at this. And we've been getting a lot of media attention and a lot of opportunity to do policy briefings with regulators. And most recently, the United Nations International Organization on Migration, the IOM, you see the little logo there, asked us to all come together to do a webinar that was for the United Nations, because these wildfires are happening all over the world, Australia, Greece, Brazil, any place that's climate impacted. And there's also issues with migrants there that are also farm workers. So they asked us to talk about the importance of California as a case study for other countries to understand and safeguard their vulnerable and essential workers, such as farm workers and mainly migrants. So again, thank you for this, and I'll leave it off to hand it over to Espy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Professor Mendez. If you can send us the links, maybe through the chat, so that way folks can get the very timely articles that you just spoke about, because I think it's very important, and that was in some of the discussions that we just had. So that would be great. And then we're also going to put in the chat the link to Professor Mendez book, and then again we have the bios that have been placed previously, but we will make sure that you all have those. And then for those folks that are participating in our hands-on training, then we will have Professor Mendez book available to you that you will be receiving soon. So again, muchísimas gracias. And I'm going to hand it off over to Leticia so she can take it from here for our next presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you once again. And I have the true pleasure of presenting Dr. Federico Castillo, who is an environmental/agriculture economist with a PhD and undergraduate degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. So go Bears, another alumni and proud Bear, originally from Costa Rica. Federico's research is centered on technology transfer and innovation, economic valuation, the socio-economic impacts of climate change, the economic aspects of protected areas and migration, which should be very relevant to our region and this topic. He is a member of a multidisciplinary team that is developing a research agenda on climate change, agriculture, once again, very related to our region, and population issues in the Berkeley campus. Most recently as well too, Dr. Castro, along with other members, including some of our board members, SB, myself, and Lupe Gallegos, and a couple of other folks, actually, he led the co-founding of the UC Berkeley Chicano, Latino Environmental Center Institute. So that'll be exciting. I hope he touches on that. And also, Doctor is bilingual in both Spanish and English, and has been heard and been seen in television various times talking on these issues. So once again, it's a pleasure for us to be able to have Professor Federico join us here today. And so with that, I will go ahead and forward the mic virtually to Dr. Federico Castillo. And once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, SP, for that extremely generous introduction. I hope not to disappoint people who are present here. I am extremely delighted to participate in this event. I want to thank, of course, SP, you and others who invited me, Environmental Justice for Water. And I am just, I have a tall order after Michael's talk. I know he's a great speaker. He's got great stories. He's a great storyteller, and hopefully, everybody, I will be able to follow up on his steps. Without further ado, I am going to start my presentation. I'm going to share the screen. Well, give me a second here to make sure we get that right. All right. So I'm assuming somebody's going to be taking care of the chat room while I speak, in case there's a question there for me or something. Feel free to ask me questions. This will, my talk will be centered on farm workers and agricultural production. I mean, I guess we just have heard over and over again how essential our farm workers are, how non-essential policymakers make our farm workers. They are essential for everybody except for those who have to write and implement policy sometimes. And so really the objective of this talk is to describe two research projects that I'm currently working on. And I'm delighted to see Rosa and others who are working on that project here. And there are our partners, of course. And then at the end, we will discuss how can we untangle what we call a policy knot in regards to farm workers. What can we do to see if we can improve working conditions and socioeconomic outputs for farm workers? I wonder if, can I leave it like this or no? Let me put it on presentation mode. Oops. Okay,
There you go.
thank you. So, what, did I open the right? Right. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about socioeconomic profile of farm workers really quick. Most of us are familiar with this profile, but it's important to put it in context. I will then speak a little bit about the agricultural sector in California really quick, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. And then I will discuss precisely the topic at hand in this case, which is the impact of heat on farm workers. And then after we speak about heat, I will narrate my my path on this project as we modify it as COVID and other aspects have come to the foreground. And then how to move the needle in favor of farm workers will be the talk or the topic of our breakout room. So what we see here is the top 10 agricultural commodities in California. California produces well over $46 billion in agricultural production. It is not necessarily the main economic activity of the state, as computers and technology takes the foreground on that, and industry. But in terms of agriculture, California really, together with Florida, feeds the state. Texas, we feed the United States to a degree. So we see that milk and cream is the main production, the main commodity there, followed by grapes, almonds. Almonds, talking about water, it's a high water intensive crop, and almonds have basically taken over a lot of land, a lot of water use. Then we have berries, lettuce, and so on and so forth. So I would just leave it that. But this just give you an idea of what exactly was produced here in the state. And this thing is not moving. I don't know why. Now it is. Okay, in terms of where the production take place, what we see here is that Kern, Fresno, Monterrey, Stanislao, Merced are the 5 highest producing counties in California. Monterrey is considered the salad bowl of the state, and to a degree, together with some parts of Florida and a little bit in the south of the United States, really the salad bowl of the United States. And if you see these crops produced in these counties, you will see really most of the crops that we saw in the previous slide. A lot of these crops are water intensive. As you know, California depends on water brought anywhere from from the Colorado River and from the mountains from the Sierra Nevada. California is a state that is highly infrastructure when it comes down to water, canals, dams, and so on and so forth were built, although not many of them have been built lately. But California is a state that basically taps every single little bit of water it can to produce these crops. So now we saw the what. This is the who of the talk here. The farm workers of California, or at least in the United States, and California is a microcosm of the United States farm labor. 2/3 of farm workers are from Mexico. There is a 6% of Central America, and there are others from Puerto Rico and so on and so forth. Let me say that this varies by city. For example, in Huron, where we're working now, very often we see people from Guatemala and other Central American countries, although Mexico continues to be in terms of demographics. The labor force in California, this is important for the talk, used to be very young, very, very young in California. This was when the flow of migrants was very constant, and before the Obama and the Trump administrations, which limited migration, especially the Trump administration greatly, the California, or at least the demographics of the U.S. labor force was very young, of the farm workers was very young, but is getting older. Is becoming less first generation. That poses a problem sometimes because second generation Latinos or Latinas and Latinas don't want to work on the fields; they want to go elsewhere. And so what you have is a shortage of labor sometimes. The age of those not born in the United States is 41 years old. This used to be much younger. And about a half of the population of the farm worker population do not have permit to work in the United States. Um, this, of course, poses a challenge when it comes down to policy, when it comes down to worker protection. It poses a challenge not because it is a challenge in and of itself. It poses a challenge because culturally we consider these individuals perhaps not worthy of some of the regulations that protects them. And when I say we, I'm saying society in general, enforcement is very lax, to put it mildly. And so this, about 50% do not have authorization to work in the United States, is a cultural problem, is a systemic problem in our system, our agricultural system, is a structural problem, the result of which we have health outcomes that are negative for this particular segment of the population. The first project that I'm going to talk about is we started talking about the heat impacts on farm workers, and so what we have here is our research team. Give them credit for the picture. We have Mr. Oops, sorry. On the left, David Lopez Carr from Santa Barbara, and the middle, Jennifer Banos from now Arizona State University, Armando Sanchez from UNAM in Mexico, and then yours truly, and finally Michael Wenner from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. This is a multidisciplinary team in terms that we have geographers, sociologists, economists, and people who deal exclusively with measuring or doing the craziness of the climate modeling, such as the Michael from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And we are funded by PIMSA, which is a Health of the Americas program, UC Berkeley, Mexico, and the University of California Global Health Institute, Planetary Health, the Center for Planetary Health Expertise, and UC Mexus. And of course, Latinx and environment is all over this program, as Espe knows it. So what's the issue with heat? Workers are exposed to heat. There is a huge dynamic around the body and in the body when workers are exposed to heat. On the one hand, they receive all kinds of rays and infrared, solar stuff input into their body. The impact depends, of course, on the individual characteristics of the individual, whether the individual is obese, whether the individual has heart problems, is a smoker, and so on and so forth. Of course, in regards to clothing, and the impact of heat on the worker depends highly on the availability of water, stations for break, stations for shade, and so on and so forth. The main measure is what you see there on the third blue line, wet bulb globe temperature, WBGT. That's the measure that is quite highly used to measure heat. And there are critical values for which heat it has an impact on farm workers. It also depends on the crop. There are some crops that are very labor intensive and they are exposed to heat all day long. And there are other crops that are less labor intensive and then the heat is less of an issue. Also, of course, there's a difference between if you are driving a tractor on the field versus if you are kneeling and bending your body and harvesting lettuce all day long. So heat, it varies the impact by individual, but there is one truth about heat and farm workers. They are usually overexposed regardless of the nature of the individual, whether it's obese or not, or this or that. And there is a moment when heat has an impact on health such that it impacts the individual's ability to carry the job. This is a two-punch impact on the system. It's an impact on the farm worker because his health, not only are his earnings being impacted by the occurrence of heat, but there is a long-term health effect, which is not necessarily taking place on the day that the heat is occurring, but accumulates over time. And then, of course, there is the issue of the individual is not able to harvest or to pick or to prune as much as he's able to do under other conditions, under non-heat conditions. Then there is an impact on the food supply. There might be an impact on the food supply, I should say, not necessarily. And also, there is an indirect impact on the fact that, as we will see later, farmers are forced either to hire more people to expose them to more heat or to pay more, which they have been doing. Real salary, as low as they are for farm workers, have been increasing, itching at an ant pace, but it has been increasing over the last 10 years, precisely because we now know because of the immigration policies and the impacts of climate change. So it's a very complex system, and one needs to isolate the best we can how to deal with the impact of heat. So we did our two projects. We have two projects. We'll see each of them individually. Is to determine the direct impact of heat on farm workers via wages lost. We also try to differentiate between different occupations on the field. We try to also differentiate by crop and city using weather data and crop production. And then, of course, the impact is on health, on income, and on the household dynamics in terms of who gets to work and how often and how many hours. There is, for example, a gender component which we do not look into, but we know that to be the case. When it's too hot, sometimes the female worker stays behind. We know this in anecdotal form. We have done focus groups in Imperial Valley, for example. And again, it has an impact on all kinds of dynamics in terms of income and so on and so forth. In the first study, what we did was we collected data for 5 counties, which are on the list of the top 5 counties producing in the United States: Imperial County, Kern County, Fresno, San Joaquin, and Yolo, which you see them on the left, and you see some of the statistics there, the agricultural value and so on and so forth. What you see on the right is the map that where deaths have occurred, and you see the areas that we have picked, heat, deaths have occurred due to heat. And what you see there on the map is that the areas that we have chosen to, we did choose to do this preliminary research, which was all desk-based. In reality, it correlates with heat occurrence, deaths, and health impacts. Also, goes without saying that the temperatures here vary a little bit from county to county, and we control for that in our study. So what do? We estimated the impact of heat on agricultural production. We then estimated the labor requirement for each crop over time. In other words, how many hours of work is required to harvest 1 acre of a particular crop. And then we estimated the impact of heat on that labor requirement through an economic model. The hypothesis is that as heat increases, there is a need to hire more labor to make up for the productivity losses. Why? Because it turns out that sometimes the heat is such that in theory, you're supposed to work at 95 degrees. And when you do that, The farmer cannot harvest and the worker loses wages, and it's a loss for everybody. And you need to make up for this. And at some point in time, you're just gonna have to hire more. But what happens when there is no more, as it is often the case in California? All right, so that's a question for later. A consequence is that as more workers are hired, more of them are negatively impacted by heat. We know this because our model estimated that. We did this for 5 crops, grapes, melons, onions. We did it for different kinds of grapes, melons only for 4 crops. And I'm just gonna show you the result for melons because it's a labor intensive crop. It requires people to bend over, to lift the stuff, and to walk over and drop the melon in a box if the harvesting machine is not near you, which sometimes is, sometimes is not. Most melons, most of the melons are still collected or harvested at daytime. Whereas, for example, some onions are now harvested at nighttime. So there were issues in regards to that in order to avoid heat. So what we did was say, what happens when the heat index goes from 95 to 100? So this is considered a bucket. And what happens is that the cost of production increases by almost, the cost of production increases by almost 2%. Now you say 2% is not that much, but remember, this is for melons, and this is on average over a 25-year period, as we have data for 25-year period. But the labor requirement increases by 4%. And this is very important. In other words, you need more people to harvest the same area, everything else being the same. And so if you cannot meet that, and then in theory, the land goes idle. When the heat index increases above 100%, the cost of production increases by almost 4%. That is attributed to labor, almost all of it. And the labor requirement increased by 5%. In other words, you need more people to harvest the same acreage if you were to hold the acreage constant. So there is a heating health cost to the worker. Has to sustain production, you have to either increase the number of hours exposed to high temperatures, and sometimes you cannot do that. Again, if you were to follow regulations, when the temperature reaches 95, you ask people to leave the field. That doesn't happen all of the time. It doesn't even happen most of the time. And in fact, we have interviewed for our labor contractors who say, well, you know, they really want to stay. They don't want to leave. So we don't even ask them, right? We don't even stop because we know they really want to be here. And that might be the case, but the health cost is huge, and it is an accumulative health cost. Or you have to increase the number of workers, as I said before, to harvest the crop on time without losses. We have to remember that, you know, agriculture is unforgivable. Either you harvest when you have to harvest, because if you don't, you might lose the crop, or you might lose part of the crop. So that was all desk work. And so, you know, we did everything. It took months and months to assemble the data. We're still trying to farm more data from that, more information from that data. Those are just the preliminary results. Our second project deals exclusively in Fresno County. We are looking at farm workers in 3 cities, mainly Huron, Coalinga, and Avenal. But if needed be, we might go to San Joaquin to collect. What are we doing? We're doing farm worker interviews. And I want to thank those here present who are doing farm worker interviews. This is not an easy task. You know, there is a whole host of reasons as to why farm workers are a difficult target group to interview, but they're doing a great job at this. So we're basically concentrating on farm workers who perform outdoor tasks, pruning, picking, etc. We are going to interview some farmers, and we intend to at least find 5 willing labor contractors, and that's a very difficult task. and the policymakers. The last three people, farmers, farm labor contractors, and policymakers, will be on the second stage interview, or this, we'll talk with them during the second stage of the project once we finish the field work with farm workers. These are our community partners in this project. The LEAP Institute, through Ray Leon, some of you know Ray very well. Of course, EJCW, SP, Rochelle, and have been extremely helpful. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do it. These are 6 enumerators that we have trained to complete the task. I'm not going to get into detail, but the job is already the data is being very interested. For example, we decided to add a COVID component to the survey. Why? If we're interviewing farm workers about heat, we might as well ask them a few questions about COVID. I will talk about that a little bit later. This is the area. I know this is a cheap map. You can see Coalinga somewhere on the left of the map. You can see Huron strictly to the right of the Highway 5. And then you can see Avenal right at the bottom center towards the south. And that forms a triangle where our enumerators are driving around and interviewing farm workers. And again, this is a very important work they're doing for the project. Enumerators were properly trained. They were properly trained on the protocol for privacy. We have gone through all the protocols. And really our goal is to share our knowledge with our partners, so that including equipment, tablets, and so on and so forth, those will be left with LEAP, the LEAP Institute, so that they can carry on their own research in partnership with us in the future. They can design projects and so on and so forth. That's the objective here. We just don't really want to show up and then leave. The idea is to develop a partnership with them. Hopefully we'll apply for more funding in the future. So it's 3 cities, the same story. Agriculture is very important. It's in Coalinga to the right bottom there. Coalinga oil is an important activity, but still farming is there. In Huron, you used to have a lot of cotton and lettuce. The agricultural activity in Huron has decreased somewhat, but it's still important. And in Avenal, you have a more diverse crop profile. Anything from tree crops to row crops are present in Avenal. So what data are we collecting right now? Farm worker survey is again between 300 and 400 workers. These are the basic demographic questions that you can think of: age, country of origin, and so on and so forth. And then we ask if they had experienced days lost or work days lost due to heat during the May-September period. We did some testing and we figured that they still can recall. We were asked to delay this project because of COVID. We couldn't go to the field when we needed to go back in July and August. But here we are. They are able to recall. They keep track of the day's work and their income. It turns out that this is not a big deal. We asked them which crop they were working on, what the crop was located, the daytime, nighttime shift, and so on and so forth. And then we plan on estimating the wages lost during those heat days. And then, of course, we're going to estimate the cost to the farmer and the family due to heat. Actually, I should say there the health cost, because workers are not only losing days worked and their related wages, but they also sometimes have to make an expense in relation to the heat. This thing is not advancing. Now it is. Okay, so we also ask how the farm workers solve the health issue. Maybe they didn't solve the health issue. There is no health clinic nearby. There, some of them use homemade remedies to deal with the heat health related problem, and so we want to know all these dynamics. We want to know what the obstacles to healthcare are, which are many and for many different reasons. We also look at the barriers, right? So we're currently collecting this data. And the impact on COVID-19, as I say, we added this at the very end. We decided, since we're going to be talking to farm workers, we're going to ask questions about COVID, and they're related, whether or not they have been tested, and the result of the test. What happened if the test came back positive? We are finding out that an important percentage of farm workers go to work regardless of whether they tested positive or not. And then we ask the reasons, and the main reason is I need the money. Okay, and this is an important health component. And again, if our farm workers were considered essential, as they are, and we're told they are, but if they were treated as essential, a farm worker wouldn't have the need to go and work, even though if the test came back positive. Approximately 12 to 15%, I checked the numbers today, and these are again changing because we're still collecting the data, of farm workers have tested positive for COVID. That is a very high number. It compares to what is going on in Salinas, where the testing is about 18%, depending on the day. The survey in Salinas of a colleague was done via phone, so we probably are getting the fact that some less percentage of farm workers testing positive because they have tested positive because we're doing the interview in person, and sometimes people don't want to talk about those things. We also ask questions about family members. If somebody has died in their household, we ask questions about remittances. If remittances have gone down during the COVID period since March, basically. We also ask if expenditures on particular household expenses, food, and transportation, and so on and so forth, have changed since COVID started, since March, basically, when the state locked down. And so we're getting some very interesting results there. Hopefully there will be another time. In closing, I want to say that these are the two problems that I just talked about are compounding factors. In other words, they add to one another: heat, COVID, and farm management. I didn't speak about farm management, but remember, heat, for example, the impact of heat is determined by the type of housing. In addition, houses tend to keep heat inside if they're not properly built, if the building codes were not respected, as it is in many instances for workers. And so we have crowding, and we have heat impacts, and all of these contribute to infection rates. In terms of farm management, as you can see here on the left, they have now implemented these plastic shields in some farms, not all of them, which in theory protect the worker. But the problem is, for example, in regards to heat and COVID, the shade areas and the water stations do not permit people to keep social distance. And so what you do here, for example, in protecting to the left a farm worker, when they go and have the water, they're not keeping distance. Nobody's asking them to do that either. And so what you have again is compounding things that add up. Climate change and COVID. COVID is not climate change related so far as we know. But climate change with farm practice conditions do not help, and they basically add up to the detriment of workers' health. I want to close with this graph. that shows pesticide use on the two left panels and heat occurrence on the right panel. And so what you have there showing is that the red areas, right? The red areas show heavy pesticide use in the state of California, and they basically coincide, perfectly coincide with a heat wave occurrence in these counties that are heavily agriculturally oriented. And so I did not speak about heat and pesticides, but if you see this graph, you can imagine the kind of issues that farm workers face in regards to their health. And the issue of pesticides is related to not only the farm worker, but their families, as pesticide residues are carried through the household via the clothing. And a lot of times housing is located next to the farm, and the pesticide drift impacts the farm worker households or housing structures and so on and so forth. So before we go to our breakout room, I wanted to tell you about the wicked problem. Every time, if I speak about heat, then we can talk about improving water station, about having breaks more often, improving clothing conditions, and so on and so forth. But then when I include COVID-19 or pesticide, then things get complicated because some of the policies for the solve one problem are not amenable to solving another problem, or they outright contradict one another for reasons of technology or whatever. So I wanted to share with you this wicked problem issue, problems that can only make better or worse, problems that are complex, where are complex interdependencies, such as when COVID and heat occurrence and happen, and that means that efforts to solve one aspect of a wicked problem might reveal or create other problems. And so I know this is not necessarily the most positive way to end the talk, but we're going to go to a breakout session where we are going to thinking about this wicked problem and how can we advocate and ultimately implement win-win policies, knowing that a sector can or will resist change, because that's what this is all about. The wicked problem, I saw it once in a business conference of sorts that I was listening to, but I thought that it applied very well to agricultural issues as well. And so in terms of farm workers, I would love for us to go to a breakout session, understanding there are compounding issues that impact our farm worker population from which we depend, and think how best to go about advocating and implementing win-win policies that result in a better health and income outcomes for our farm workers. And with that, I close. If there are any questions, I would love to hear them. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Dr. Castillo, you did mention that one of the issues that was also a labor shortage, because their labor in the valley, or in California as a whole for that matter, farm labor has been harder and harder to secure for a lot of folks.
Yes.
And what do you attribute that to be? Why do you think that's the case?
Thank you for that. So there are two main reasons for that. Number one is, despite the emergence of despite the improvement in technology in terms of harvesting machinery and all the rest, right? We use drones now in farms to collect soil samples to measure humidity. It has gotten technologically very high technology. There has been an increase in the crop acreage that are labor intensive, particularly on the berry side. So you got more strawberries, more blueberries, and more huckleberries and all kinds of berries. And then there is the lettuce issue and so on and so forth. So the demand for this crop has increased. There has been an increase in the acreage, and hence you need more hands to harvest this. And so there is only so many hands to go around. That's the number one reason. Number two reason, again, we have an aging farm labor sector. As they age, they're not replaced by the second generation. Their kids don't want to go and harvest on the fields. Sometimes they go and help in the summer, but they want to go to college too. And I have several students that do this at Berkeley. And I can imagine many, many others that go to Fresno State or that go to here and there, and that's the reason. And the third is basically the migration policies of the Trump administration, right? Basically closing the border to the best way they can, not understanding that the agricultural sector is impacted greatly by that policy. And I'm not advocating for a larger flow of migration. I'm advocating for a larger flow of migration that might result in higher wages, which is possible. This is not an impossible task. It's just that we don't set out to do that. So those are the three reasons, Eddie, if I may, that I think contribute to that.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo.
Sure. Is there any other questions?
You also mentioned, I'm sorry, you mentioned substandard housing conditions as contributing to both heat and also COVID spread amongst farm workers. I work with a nonprofit organization, and I've noticed throughout the valley, because we basically our region covers all the counties that you conducted your study in, that the migrant camps that are run by USDA are practically vacant. They're at a very low capacity, whereas you see areas that are substandard being occupied, primarily because a lot of the farm workers are no longer migrant workers. They tend to be more they tend to stay in areas as opposed to migrating from areas they did historically in the past. And a lot of these USDA run facilities are are restrictive only to migrant laborers, which seems kind of like a waste. I don't know if that's something that on the policy side could be changed in this next administration.
Right. So, this is something that we can or should advocate, better housing condition for farm workers. But, if you read Cesar Chavez, he didn't write a hell of a lot, but some of the writings that he left us with, and if you talk to people who are veterans of the movement, Dolores Huerta and others, they will tell you the housing conditions, USDA or not USDA, has not improved greatly, right? And so that is an issue. I would defer to Rosa, present here, who is collecting data with us. And she and I have gone, and she has taken me to visit a few farm worker camps in Huron. I have seen others in Bakersfield, and I have seen others in Imperial Valley. And if you were to take a picture of the place today with a picture of the place 20 years ago, it would be no change whatsoever sometimes, right? And so yes, moving workers from this kind of situation to other facilities that are probably better run, better maintained would be a good policy. But I imagine that there are all kinds of paperwork related to that, and it's something that we probably could advocate to change that particular barrier, so to speak. Yeah. But housing is a huge determinant, I would say. Let me just close with the housing issue. I will share with you a paper that is going to get published that we just produced. We talk about housing. Housing has to do with heat, it has to do with pesticide, and it has to do with COVID. And housing conditions for farm workers today, they're getting impacted by housing in all three fronts, right? Because when there is heat, the structures retain heat indoors. So the farmer comes from the farm, exposed to 90, 95, 100 degrees. They go home to a cooker, right? Where 20 people live. I mean, I'm just making the number up, but many people live per unit. And that's COVID right there. So housing is a big factor. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castillo. I hope everyone enjoyed that. Again, this is Leticia Corona. If you can please pose your question to the group before going into the breakout session, we would greatly appreciate so folks are better prepared to know what to discuss.
Sure. So again, I want you to think about this wicked problem concept and housing. Let's take housing. Housing is, again, one of those where you can get win-win policies. If you were to improve housing, you're going to get improvements all over the place. But the wicked problem that I just described here, where there are many components and moving parts to solving a particular problem, health outcomes for farm workers, requires that somebody is going to be robbed in the wrong place. Somebody's going to end up paying more for something, a higher tax or something. So in the breakout rooms, I would like the groups to discuss of a way that we can think of improving one policy that you think results in better health outcomes, for example, or incomes for farm workers without falling into the wicked problem paradigm where you are basically tied up and not being able to move anywhere. So in the breakout room, I would like you to think of one way, one policy that you don't have to agree, but that you think might end up being a win-win situation, and don't fall into the trap of the wicked problem. I hope that was clear. I don't know.